I'm going to start with Seamus Drown, who says, I haven't fully read the report yet, but it's stated that our corruption ratings are falling recently. Over what time frame has this been happening? And what could you say specifically about current and recent governments in relation to this? So, Philippa, you did the research. What's the time frame that you see the rankings slipping over?
So this has been happening over about, I think it's over about the last 10 years. We used to kind of swap around 1 and 2 for a while, and then it was 2 and 3, and now we sort of seem more firmly in position number 3. And I would also recommend Transparency International recently published a report on this decline, and they've done some more work verifying and trying to look at the reasons why that decline has happened. They conclude that it's sort of actually across the board. There's not really 1 or 2 specific things you can point to, but it's sort of a general loss of trust and increased perception of corruption. So they do think it's real. So I would recommend having a look at their report if you want to really dig down into the detail of what's going on there.
And is that New Zealand Transparency International or global?
That's New Zealand Transparency International.
Okay.
I'll throw a link.
If anyone could put a link in the chat,
yeah.
I think people would be interested in that. Thank you. Marie Dool has a question. Vested interests tend to be masterful at framing their objectives as being aligned with the public interest. And of course, there is some alignment generally, but the nebulous concept of the public interest itself does confound diagnosis of capture/corruption. Any thoughts on how to sharpen this definition for those purposes and enable more defensible diagnosis? Chris, would you like to field that one?
Not really, but I'll try. That's a very good question. It's a very tough one because, yes, people invoke the public interest all the time when really it's not the public interest, but it's a sector of the public interest or it's personal interest. And so there's no one fix-all answer to that very searching question. But I guess what we've been talking about is what are a range of mechanisms that could be passed by Parliament to improve transparency and accountability that will enable us to talk about public interest in an apolitical national sense. But it's a really good point because invocation of the public interest, take, for example, an industry that's been referred to on a number of occasions this morning, the extractive industries. Oh, it's in the national interest that we have access to these minerals to improve the wealth of communities, for example, on the West Coast, and to lower unemployment and so on. You can invoke the national interest whenever it suits you for a particular purpose. What Philip is talking about is a set of policies that will enable New Zealand to talk about the national interest in, as I say, apolitical and more general terms.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. UN, we have a question from Dan O'Brien, which says, what's the role of the media in shedding light on these issues? Or are they themselves a victim of political influence? Can an independent media be supported further? Any thoughts on the role of the media here?
Oh, that's a great question. I must say that I've been very impressed by the sharpness and quality of questions that's been coming in through the Q&A. You know, historically, for example, during the what is known as the U.S. Gilded Age, which was a time when America was having rapid economic takeoff, but was extremely corrupt, muckraking journalism, investigative journalism played a very big role in eliminating bribery and extortion in the country. So yes, I think a free, independent, and courageous press is absolutely crucial, but that role has to be reinvented and adapted for a new age where we have access money. And some of the key challenges of journalism in exposing access money is, first of all, that it requires the journalists to have a much higher level of technical knowledge, right? Both legal and financial. in order to understand esoteric arrangements like what Philippa had just described, these opaque bank accounts that are being set up for tax evasion and so on, all of that requires journalists with a much higher level of legal, financial, technical knowledge. Another is that we now live in a world where the public has very short attention span, right? So if you reported on a corruption scandal that is about, bribery or stealing 50 million from the treasury, that is an easy story to write and to sell. But to be able to inform the public about the nuances of access money when it's not illegal, when it's institutionalized, when you can't even really prosecute anyone, that is a much harder story to tell. It takes both commitment and professionalism on the part of journalism, but I also think that it will take a high quality and informed citizenry. The two parts have to come together. You need someone to supply that high quality information, as well as a public that demands that sort of high quality journalism.
Mm. Yes, and I think also best served by what we'd probably call here long form journalism. So these are, quite complex issues. So the opportunity to have a good documentary with a radio or TV or long form print or online media is important, and the pressures on the news cycle and the nature of programming now often mitigate against that as well. So food for thought. I'm going to come to a question from David Geller and direct it to Philippa. David says, much is made of the hugely important issue of not eroding public trust. Less attention is directed specifically to the advantages of actively engaging civil society in decision-making and moving towards the normalization of using sortition, that was a new phrase to me, I hope Philippa knows him, and citizens' assemblies to guide governments in their decision-making, as opposed to just leaving it to government. What's your view on opportunities like this for New Zealand, Philippa?
Okay, so for those who don't know, sortition is an idea of governing by ballot. So instead of electing 120 parliamentarians, you just randomly select 120 people to go into parliament. Obviously, it doesn't have to be at a legislative level. Things like citizens' juries can do this too. So you randomly select a group of people to have a conversation with experts on an issue, become informed about it, and then draw some conclusions of it on it. There are various kinds of consultation techniques that help to both get an idea of how the general population feels about an issue, but also to make people more informed at the same time and help build some level of consensus. There are other kinds of direct democracy, such as greater use of referendums. Lots of people point to Switzerland on this. And I think there absolutely are many opportunities in New Zealand to use these different and newer techniques. Actually, some of them very old, but to use a greater variety of techniques to get a better understanding of where consensus lies, what issues most people are interested in. And I mean, I think these transparency issues are actually quite a good example, because there is quite a high degree of consensus in the public that they want their parliaments and their governments to be less corrupt. There are perceptions of corruption. And the difficulty is mostly kind of with the 120 MPs in the building, where everyone else has kind of agreed on more or less on what they would like to see. So yeah, I think there are lots of opportunities there, and we should be exploring those.
Yeah. Okay, so let me come to Andrew Ecclestone's question, and I'll direct it to Chris. Andrew asks, since the passage of the Official Information Act, international standards for freedom of information laws have been developed. And one of them is that withholding grounds should always be subject to an overriding public interest test. The withholding grounds in Section 6 of our OIA are not subject to a public interest override. For example, in the UK Freedom of Information law, the international relations exemption is subject to a public interest override, but New Zealand's withholding ground is not. Do you think, Chris, the Act should be strengthened by adding a public interest test to Section 6?
Yes, I think the Act could be strengthened in a number of ways. When we passed it, I think we were the first in the world to move to this kind of regime and move away from an Official Secrets Act regime, but we've kind of rested on our laurels with the OIA a bit. And I think we've been overtaken by other jurisdictions. And I think Philippa touches on this in her report. So the answer to your question is yes, but not only strengthened in relation to Section 6, but also strengthened in other areas as well. And as Philippa says, and I happen to agree with her, extending the scope of the OIA to the parliamentary precinct. So much has to be done with that legislation because I think we've slipped behind the rest of the world, and some of those key principles are now somewhat blurred.
Yes, it's old law now, and I think very overdue for a good update. Let me come to Morwenna Mitson Grills, who asks, and I'll direct this to Professor Yuen, what can, quote, ordinary, unquote, citizens do when they see what appears to be corrupt practice in government? It's so easy to feel powerless and to do nothing.
Wow, that is a great question. It is a very hard question as well. I don't profess to have the answer for that. But I would say that one of the greatest advantages of a democracy is that citizens have the freedom to organize. And so being able, if you see problems with access money, you do have the freedom to get into groups with other concerned citizens to voice, to raise awareness about these issues. So I think that is one possibility. And another thing that I have, at least myself, taken away from this discussion is this is a really informed and concerned citizenry that I'm hearing in the Q&A. I'm really impressed by that. I am hopeful in thinking that given New Zealand's high quality of governance, your informed and concerned citizenry, and your willingness to address these issues of access money, that I think that could be a real opportunity here for New Zealand to, show, to demonstrate a way forward of how we can tackle these issues, not only in terms of laws and legislations, but also in terms of civic participation. I don't know enough about the New Zealand context to comment on the avenues for participation, and I think I would leave Helen or Philippa to comment on that. But I would just emphasize that there is a real opportunity here. In many other countries where I've spoken on the same issue, even in the United States, which is a high income advanced democracy, there's a real sense of powerlessness among citizens because there's a great distance between the federal government and a citizen on the ground. I think New Zealand is in a much better condition, not only because it's a much smaller country, but I think you have, you strike me at least as having much stronger solidarity, a much stronger sense that an average citizen can voice an opinion and make a difference.
Thank you, Yuen. Very important points. I've got a question from David Shand, which I'll put to Chris. David, remembered by many of us, as the winner on the night of the Wellington Central electorate in 1975. But the result didn't stick. But David says, yes, lobbyists may seek preferential access to political decision makers. But what about, quote, corruption, end quote, in terms of concentrated media, press and social power, e.g. Murdoch Press? bypassing this by influencing public opinion in favour of a particular action or decision by concentrated media power. What controls are possible here? Chris, any reflections on this? I don't think we have Murdoch Press in New Zealand these days, but is this concentration of media power potentially also an issue?
Yeah, well, I acknowledge you, David. To have lost by 27 votes must have been a nightmare. I never affected me because I always lost to Annette by about 10,000. If I can simply say this, yeah, I actually was reflecting on your question because I was looking at the Q&As, and you're absolutely right. The Murdoch Press is a very good example. Although Fox News seems to have become less hyper-partisan, I don't know, because I think maybe they can see through Trump now. But it's a real problem, and I don't know that there's a very easy answer to it. Wasn't, Helen, in the 1960s, wasn't there an attempt to keep Murdoch out of New Zealand, for example, and the news media ownership legislation? I don't know that that worked. The trouble is that most media these days are in one camp or another, and they are propaganda sheets. The nearest thing we have to a newspaper of record in New Zealand is the Herald, and it's not a shadow of what it used to be. So I literally, David, don't know the answer to your question, whether it's something that's too large for one country to control. Helen, I'd be interested in your views, but having reflected on David's insightful question, I have to say, after all the verbiage, David, I have no immediate answer. I don't know.
I mean, we do have laws governing concentration of media ownership, as I understand it still. But our media is under incredible pressure, isn't it? Yeah. The economics are just against the more conventional media, but we are seeing quality online media. And maybe part of its challenge is to become more broadly known to the general public. I think, the journalists at Newsroom NZ or the Spin-Off, for example, do a terrific job. There's others like Bernard Hickey who does, regular podcasts and newsletters, but often this isn't as accessible to the general public as, turning the dial on the radio or whatever. So how quality journalism can reach all demographics is an issue. Does it need to be on TikTok? Does it need to be on Spotify? What is it that it will take to get through to, for example, younger generations? Philippa, Nick Pacey says, we need an independent commission against corruption. You didn't go quite that far. What do you think?
I think we probably do need to have a look at our anti-corruption institutions. The anti-corruption roles are kind of spread out across quite a broad range of agencies, and some things do fall through the cracks between them. Part of the issue is that there are a whole lot of things that look like corruption that aren't illegal yet, and I think part of the making them illegal would actually be having some institutions to enforce that. I think the police really struggle with this. For example, police have to enforce electoral law, and I think they really, really struggle with that. We saw recently what seemed like an absolute open and shut case of failure to declare donations, and through carelessness, not through kind of deliberate malice. But there is a separate law against that, and it was very surprising to see the police decide not to prosecute that. And I am concerned that some of the institutions are not necessarily independent enough. And I think as we improve our laws, we probably would need a separate anti-corruption agency to deal with these things.
Well, I agree with Professor Yuen that the questions have been outstanding, and if we had another 2 hours, we'd probably get through many more of them, which we don't have, as we're very close now to closing time. If I could end with one constructive suggestion. New Zealand is still a member of the Open Government Partnership, which, in full disclosure, I happen to be a global ambassador for on a totally pro bono and voluntary basis, and just chaired a major event for them at the UN, a major round table. And the Open Government Partnership, countries that come in on the basis that government and civil society will work together to improve openness and transparency in government. Now, under those proceedings, there is a joint action plan, which is co-developed. In New Zealand, the partner for coordinating government has been State Services Commission, and then there's been a range of civil society partners, including Transparency International local branch. Suzanne Snively has, of course, been active in that in the past, if not still. So it may be that leading up to the next joint action plan, some of these issues could also be put on the agenda of our open government partnership. The meeting I chaired in the UN last Thursday, or on the margins of the UN General Assembly, had representatives from many countries and their civil society, and really very encouraging to hear the innovative things that are being done. So again, I think Professor Yuen called on us to be innovative, and I think we have opportunities to do that. So thank you so much to our three panelists, Honourable Chris Finlayson, Philippa Yazbek, Professor Yuen Ang, and back to you, Murray.